Today we're going to talk about the importance of personal protective equipment, or PPE, in preventing workplace injuries. We'll begin with an overview of how hazard assessments are conducted and why specific types of PPE are selected. Even though you, as an employee, are not responsible for these procedures, you still need to be aware of when PPE is necessary and what type of PPE is appropriate. Then we'll focus on ways you could keep yourself safe on the job. We'll discuss how to wear PPE and care for PPE that may be assigned to you and go over limitations of each piece of equipment. Let's get started. By the end of this training session, you will understand how your employer conducts a PPE hazard assessment, including how they evaluate the workplace and job functions for any potential hazards that can be controlled by using PPE. Understand why different types of PPE are selected and how they protect you against the hazards found during a hazard assessment. And know how to properly wear and care for your PPE. Before we begin, let's take a few minutes to see how much you already know about personal protective equipment. Decide whether each statement on the screen is true or false. Hazard assessments are conducted only for job functions that involve hazardous materials. True or false? False. Your employer is responsible for selecting PPE. True or false? True. PPE should be inspected before each use. True or false? True. It is not important to keep your PPE clean. True or false? False. How did you do? A hazard assessment is essential to understand the types of hazards employees like you might be exposed to. It is a requirement of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, that hazard assessments be performed before PPE is selected. Here is an overview of how our hazard assessment is conducted. First, your employer evaluates every job function and every department for potential hazards. If any hazards are found during their assessment, they record what hazards are. Potential hazards in the work area include impact from objects or equipment, chemical exposure, heat, harmful dust, optical radiation, or falls. Then they determine what part of the body each hazard is a risk to. In this session, we'll focus on the eyes and face, respiratory system, hands, feet, and head. Finally, your employer determines what type of PPE will protect against the hazards that are found. For example, if there is an eye hazard present, they will determine if safety glasses are adequate or whether goggles are needed. This is an example of a PPE hazard assessment form for the University of Kentucky. As we see here on the first page, it identifies the location, the type of employee, and we look at the eye hazards, head, neck, and face hazards, foot hazards, hand hazards, body hazards, fall hazards, noise hazards, and respiratory hazards. Hazard assessments are conducted to protect each part of the body. Let's start with the face and eyes. Your employer checks for exposure to flying particles such as dust from grinding, metal chips from machine shop equipment, or wood chips from a cabinet shop. Fine particles cause the majority of eye injuries in the workplace. Molten metal is a hazard if workers are exposed to metal that could splash up and damage the eyes or burn the face. Hazardous liquids are also common eye and face hazards. Examples include aerosols, cleaning solutions, solvents for cleaning metal, spray adhesive, and spray paints. These might be splashed or sprayed into a worker's face or eyes. Here are some other eye and face hazards that are evaluated. Acid or caustic liquids are especially dangerous because they can do serious damage to the eyes and face. Examples include acids used for etching, caustic liquids used in a number of cleaning operations, and battery acids from electric power vehicles such as forklifts. Gases and vapors can also cause eye damage. For example, ammonia, which is used in some air conditioning systems, can cause severe eye damage. Other vapors and gases can cause redness and irritation. Potentially, light radiation, which is a bright light from welding and cutting operations or from laser operations. Eyes can be severely damaged if you look directly at welding or laser operations without proper protection. Hazard assessments for respiratory protection evaluate the following: potential inhalation of airborne dust, fumes, or similar particles, which might come from grinding, cutting, sanding, or welding operations. Other dust might come from wood chips, grain, or other solid granular materials. Another hazard is the inhalation of vapors and fumes, which can come from a wide variety of operations, including hazardous materials. A few examples include solvents, spraying with aerosols, painting operations, and bulk handling, including loading and unloading of the hazardous materials. Lack of adequate oxygen usually refers to jobs in confined spaces where there might not be enough oxygen to enter without respiratory protection. Think about the kinds of jobs and operations in your workplace that require respiratory protection. After the assessment has identified the potential respiratory hazards, your employer takes the following steps. First, they identify the specific sources of respiratory hazard. Then they review the work processes to determine where the exposure exists and the magnitude of the exposure. And finally, if necessary, they monitor the exposure to measure the degree of the hazard. To know if we are at risk of hearing loss, we must evaluate our noise exposure. The first step in evaluating our noise exposure is to conduct a noise survey. A noise survey will identify and characterize high noise sources and identify employees who are impacted by high noise levels. Next, the noise exposure of employees at risk is evaluated. Because employees typically move through the workday, a noise dosimeter, as seen on the screen here, is typically used. The dosimeter records all the noise levels and computes the average noise exposure level for that particular employee. This information can be transferred to other employees who do similar jobs. Monitoring is repeated whenever a change in production, process, or equipment influences noise level exposures. Now let's move on to head hazards. Falling objects can be a major cause of head injuries. Some jobs expose workers to objects falling from above, such as workplaces with scaffolding and catwalks, where workers are above and below each other. Exposed electrical conductors may be a hazard, requiring the use of appropriate hard hats, those that do not conduct electricity. Finally, low-hanging obstructions present another hazard, such as when a worker needs to walk or crawl under equipment and perform maintenance or cleaning. A hazard assessment does not forget potential fit hazards. There are many possible hazards to feet, including falling, rolling, or sharp objects that are dropped on the feet by workers who handle heavy objects. In some workplaces, there may be exposure to heavy rolling objects such as large rolls of paper or forklift tires, which can crush someone's foot. Another potential hazard is the presence of sharp objects that might pierce the sole of a worker's shoe and foot. There may be electrical hazard in some workplaces that require the use of insulated footwear that contains no metal. Slippery walking surfaces may cause falls. While a fall might not injure the foot, slippery floors are considered a foot hazard because proper footwear is required to reduce the hazard. Hazardous materials could be a foot hazard if there is the possibility of them splashing on the feet or seeping through the soles of your shoes. Finally, cold weather conditions can be a foot hazard if there is a possibility of frostbite. A hand hazard assessment is very comprehensive because there are so many different possible causes of hand injuries. Skin absorption of hazardous materials can often occur through the hands and can cause skin damage. Severe cuts and lacerations can result from working with machinery and equipment. These machines should have protective guarding, but you still need to know about the possible hazards. Cutting equipment such as saws and drills can cause severe injury if the hand is placed near the point of operation. Hand tools can cause punctures and severe cuts if not handled carefully. Other types of hand hazards include puncture wounds, which can result from a wide variety of tools and equipment such as drills, nail guns, and even screwdrivers. Sliver of metals or wood can also cause deep punctures. Burns can be caused by handling acids, caustics, and many strong hazardous materials. Depending on the concentration of corrosive, burns can be quite severe. Thermal burns, or burns from heat, can result from welding, cutting, and brazing operations. Steam equipment, such as a boiler, may involve extremely hot items, such as pipes and tanks. Industrial ovens for baking, drying, and annealing present obvious thermal burn hazards. And finally, frostbite can result from working outside in frigid conditions or from working with cryogenic materials. Evaluating hazards include an assessment to determine proper clothing. Here are some of the hazards that will require you to wear protective clothing. Hot or cold materials or objects can cause skin damage. If you work around steam lines or in other hot environments, or work in refrigerated areas or other cold environments, you probably need protective clothing or other equipment. If you work with hazardous materials, you may need to wear protective clothing, in addition to protective gloves, boots, and eyewear to guard against splashes. Welding often requires wearing fire-resistant clothing to prevent being burned by sparks. If you work with heavy, sharp, or rough materials, you usually need to wear protective clothing to protect against cuts and abrasions on your body, arms, and legs. Finally, if you work around moving machinery, you should be alert to the type of clothing you wear, since loose clothing may get caught in moving parts. Now it's time for an exercise. Read through the following statements and fill in the missing blanks. Blank blank caused the majority of eye injuries in the workplace. Flying particles. Oops. Lack of adequate oxygen is a respiratory hazard usually found in jobs in confined spaces. A slippery floor is considered a blank hazard. Foot hazard. Blank clothing should not be worn while working around moving machinery. Loose clothing. Service pits and repair pits are considered blank hazards. Fall hazards. In this part of the session, we'll talk about how your employer selects the appropriate personal protective equipment for 4 different hazards. We'll also focus on how to properly wear and care for each piece of PPE. Let's start with the different types of eye and face protection. Safety glasses with side protection are designed to protect against flying objects, such as metal or wood chips. Goggles protect the eyes against flying objects and from floating dust, hazardous liquids, gases, and vapors. Face shields are needed to protect against splashes, hot slag, flying debris, and molten metal. The face shield that is selected should be specific to the hazard. Shaded filtered lenses are worn to protect against potentially harmful light radiation, such as from welding operations or certain laser equipment. Prescription safety glasses may be appropriate if you need corrective eyewear. Wearing contact lenses is not recommended when exposed to such a hazard as dust, hazardous liquids, or vapors in high temperatures. All approved eye and face protection must be marked Z87, meaning that it complies with the American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, standard for eye PPE. If eye protection is required for your job function, it's important that you wear and care for it properly. Here are some steps to follow. PPE for eyes and face should always fit comfortably. Eyewear shouldn't pinch your nose or put pressure on your head. Eyewear should not distort or block your vision. If you're experiencing dizziness or headaches from wearing eye protection, try another style or brand. Remember to put eyewear on before being exposed to a hazard. This may seem obvious, but many eye injuries occur each year because workers forget to put on their protective eyewear before starting a hazardous job. Keep protective eyewear clean by washing regularly with soap and water or with special cleaning products. Regular cleaning helps make sure that your vision is not blocked or blurred. If you are exposed to dust or hazardous liquids while wearing goggles, make sure to clean off the top rim of the goggles before removing them. This prevents dust or liquid from dripping or falling into the eyes when the PPE is removed. Dispose of protective eyewear if scratched or otherwise damaged, because it may not fit correctly, may distort your vision, or provide inadequate protection. As with protective eyewear, there are different kinds of respiratory PPE that may be selected according to the kind of hazards involved. A filtering face piece or dust mask is worn to protect against inhaling dust. You may choose to wear a dust mask voluntarily if you are exposed to low levels of dust. However, if you are exposed to high levels of dust or hazardous dust above permissible exposure limits, or PELs, you are required to wear a filtering face piece. Air purifying respirators, either full face or half face, are the most common type of respiratory protection. These respirators use cartridge or filters to purify the air being breathed in and provide protection against vapors and fumes. Air purifying respirators must be worn by workers when monitoring shows the PELs have been exceeded. At levels below the PEL, you may choose to wear a respirator. Cartridges for air purifying respirators are carefully chosen by your employer. No type of cartridge will filter out all possible contaminants, so the cartridge will be specific to the hazard. In addition, it is important to know how long it takes for each hazardous material to break through the cartridge. This lets you know how often the cartridge must be replaced. Here are some other types of respiratory protection. Air-supplied respirators are used for high concentration of hazardous materials or in atmospheres that do not have enough oxygen. Self-containing breathing apparatus, or SCBA, is used under conditions that are immediately dangerous to life and health, such as an emergency response to a serious chemical spill. Remember that all respirators and filtering face pieces must be certified by the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, or NIOSH. The appropriate wear and care of respiratory protection is extremely important if it is to provide proper protection. To begin, medical approval is required for some types of respirators. Your workplace respiratory protection program includes information about the necessary medical approvals. A fit test must be conducted at least annually if you are required to wear a respirator. Fit testing involves different techniques to make sure the respirator seals to your face properly. Finally, you should always inspect your respirator before each use, checking parts such as the seal, head straps, valves, and cartridges for signs of cracking, wear, or other damage. Any damaged parts should be discarded and replaced. Here are some more steps to follow if you wear a respirator in the workplace. Check the seal of the respirator every time you put it on to make sure it fits properly to your face. A positive seal check involves breathing out while blocking the exhalation valve to see if the air escapes. A negative seal check involves covering the inhalation valve while breathing in. The respirator should stay caved in, or if it doesn't, the seal leaks. You should clean your respirator regularly. Daily cleaning might involve using an alcohol wipe. A thorough cleaning needed periodically involves taking the respirator apart and cleaning it with soap and water, then leaving the parts to air dry. It is also important to properly store your respirator in a sealed plastic bag and store it so the natural shape is not distorted. Hearing protection is required when you work in areas that contain loud sound. There are many types of hearing protection, including earplugs, canal caps, and earmuffs. There are many different styles and brands of earplugs, but they all look very similar. Earplugs offer great protection from noise and are lightweight and unobstructive. Just remember to make sure the earplugs are clean before inserting them in your ear. Get a new pair at the beginning of each day. Canal caps are useful for employees who are exposed to loud noise for short periods of time, or someone who just has to walk through a high noise area. They usually do not have the same protection as the plugs because they do not enter the ear canal. They merely just cap the canal entrance. Earmuffs are generally used as a supplemental protection from noise. They might be used in addition to earplugs to help reduce noise exposure even further. Headphones from portable radios do not count as hearing protection. If the earmuffs do not fit perfectly or seal adequately, they can actually increase noise exposure because noise may actually echo inside the muff. The following guidelines should be followed when wearing earmuffs. Muffs must fully enclose the ear and seal against the head. Pull back your hair from beneath the muffs. Make sure glasses and caps don't interfere with the seal. Adjust headbands so cushions exert even pressure. Clean muffs with warm, soapy water and rinse thoroughly. As with other types of PPE, if head hazards are found in your workplace, your employer selects head protection specific to each hazard. Here are some examples. Hard hats protect the head from impact or penetration. They are usually made of high-density polyurethane, so they are lightweight but strong enough to protect against falling objects. Electrical insulation hard hats are used to reduce the risk of electrical shock and can protect against such hazards as power lines. However, do not assume that a hard hat will protect against electrical hazards just because it is not made of metal. Bump caps should be used around low-hanging objects such as pipe, steel structures, or machinery parts. However, bump caps are not intended to protect against falling objects or electrical hazards. Hard hats in the workplace must meet ANSI standards and be marked with a Z89 to show they meet these standards. Head protection needs to be worn correctly and cared for properly. Head protection must fit properly. There are different kinds of suspension systems for hard hats, and you should know how to adjust the suspension for a secure and comfortable fit. Inspect the hat before each use. Check for cracks or any other damage that might reduce the ability of the hard hat to provide protection. This includes inspecting the suspension system for cracks, worn straps, or other damage. Make sure the suspension system is installed properly and not backwards. Clean hard hats regularly with soap and water. Finally, hard hats should be used only for their intended purpose, which is to protect the head. They should not be used as a seat or a step stool. This might damage them and reduce their ability to protect the head when worn. Wearing foot protection is another important way to reduce the risk of serious injuries. Different types of foot PPE include steel-toed work boots or shoes protecting against rolling or falling objects that could crush your toes. Some footwear provides metatarsal protection, that is, it protects the bones of the foot behind the toes. Other types of protection footwear provide steel in the heel and along the ankle to keep your ankle from being twisted. The sole of the shoe or boot can protect against different kinds of hazards. Some soles are puncture resistant to protect against sharp objects, while slip resistant soles prevent injury on wet or slippery floors, and still others prevent absorption. Be aware that surfaces with water on them require a different kind of slip resistant sole than surfaces with oily substances. Chemical resistant boots are needed if there is a risk of splashing from liquid chemicals, acids, or caustics. Waterproof and cold weather footwear may be needed if you work in wet, muddy, or cold conditions. Rain boots made of PVC or rubber can help keep your feet dry. Special liners can insulate feet against extreme cold. Lastly, Protective footwear must be marked Z41 to show that they comply with the ANSI standards. The proper wear and care for foot protection should not be taken for granted. Protective footwear should be comfortable, just like everyday shoes. You should inspect your footwear before each use to ensure it will provide the intended protection. Make sure there are no holes or cracks in the waterproof boots or footwear designed to protect against hazardous liquids. Check your soles for excessive wear, especially if they are intended to protect against slips or punctures. Finally, keep your protective footwear clean. Dirt, mud, and hazardous materials should be removed after each use to help keep the footwear in good condition. The proper hand protection is essential for protecting against a wide range of possible injuries. Let's take a look at the different types of hand PPE. Chemical resistant gloves can be made of rubber, latex, Viton, nitrile, neoprene, or PVC, and they are graded by the manufacturer for degradation and breakthrough time. The type of chemical resistant gloves chosen will be specific to the chemical being used. Gloves made of Kevlar or metal mesh are resistant to cuts and punctures. These kinds of gloves should be worn when handling saws, knives, or glass. Leather or canvas work gloves are commonly used to protect against cuts and scrapes. They can be coated with other materials to improve their grip. Extreme temperatures of hot or cold require special gloves. Gloves made of terry cloth, leather, or pigskin help protect against burns. Gloves with liners are helpful when working in cold conditions. Electricians need linemen's gloves designed to protect against different levels of voltage. High voltage gloves are black rubber with red interior so that any cuts or damage to the outside layer can easily be seen. Liners are worn under these gloves to help absorb perspiration. As with all kinds of personal protective equipment, the proper wear and care of hand protection is extremely important. Protective gloves should fit comfortably. Gloves should not be too tight, which restricts your hand movement, or too loose, which creates the hazard of being snagged or limits the ability to grip and feel properly. Inspect protective gloves before each use. Check chemical resistant gloves for cracks, holes, cuts, or other damage. Gloves that protect against cut and punctures should not be worn if they are torn or have a puncture. Electrician gloves should not have any tears or scrapes. Heat-resistant gloves should not have any abrasions on the outer surface or damage to the inner linings. Keep gloves clean and dry. You should decontaminate chemical-resistant gloves after each use. It's also important to discard gloves if they become damaged or contaminated. As a final point, with proper protection, we'll discuss how general work clothing is selected to guard against possible hazards. Long sleeve shirts and long pants help protect the skin against contact with cold or cold objects. Long sleeve shirts and long pants also protect against sharp or rough materials that could cause cuts and abrasions. They also may be necessary if working in cold conditions, in addition to coat and a jacket. Flame retardant clothing should be worn by welders or grinders who are exposed to sparks. Loose clothing and jewelry should not be worn if you're exposed to moving machinery. Long hair should be tied back, even long beards. The machinery might grab a loose sleeve, ties, lapels, cuffs, hair, bracelets, rings, and pull that body part into the machine. Finally, chemical-resistant clothing provides protection against the specific materials being used. OSHA defines fall protection as any equipment, device, or system that prevents a worker from falling from an elevation or mitigates the effect of a fall. There are several fall protection options depending on your particular work activity. The guardrail system is a barrier erected along an unprotected or exposed edge, side, or other walking surface to prevent workers from falling to a lower level. The safety net system, or horizontal or semi-horizontal cantilever style barriers that use a netting system to stop falling workers before they make contact with a lower level or obstruction. Personal fall arrest systems or stops a fall before the worker contacts a lower level. If consistent, it consists of a body harness, anchorage, and connector that may include a lanyard, deacceleration device, lifeline, or a suitable combination. Body belts are not allowed as part of personal fall arrest system. A positioning system is a system of equipment and connectors that, when used with a body harness or a body belt, allows a worker to be supported on an elevated vertical surface, such as a wall or a windowsill, and work with both hand frees. The travel resistance system is a combination of an anchorage connector, lanyard, and body support system to eliminate the possibility of a worker going over an unprotected edge or side of a working surface. The ladder safety system is a system attached to a fixed ladder designed to eliminate or reduce the possibility of a worker falling off the ladder. It usually consists of a carrier, safety sleeve, lanyard, connectors, and body harness. Cages and wells are not considered ladder safety systems. Your personal fall protection system and their components need to be used exclusively for fall protection and not for other purpose, such as hoisting equipment or materials. Inspect before each initial use during each work shift for mildew, wear, damage, and other deterioration, and damaged parts must be removed for service. Now it's time for another exercise. See if you can match each hazard with the type of PPE that would protect against it. To protect against potentially harmful radiation light, you would wear shaded filter lenses, a form of PPE that protects against low-hanging objects. You would wear a bump cap. Rolling and falling objects could crush your toes, so you should wear steel toe footwear. To protect against sparks, you would wear flame retardant clothing. If you are handling hazardous materials, chemical resistant gloves would be necessary. Lastly, to protect against fall hazards, you could use a positioning system. It is important to remember that you may have to wear multiple forms of PPE if hazard poses a risk to other parts of your body as well. Here are some key points to remember from our session. Every job function in every department is assessed for hazards. Each part of the body is taken into consideration during the assessment. PPE is selected in response to specific hazards. And finally, proper wear and care of PPE is necessary to provide effective protection. This concludes today's training session on personal protective equipment, what employees need to know. And remember, at UK, safety begins with you.